Okay, to anybody joining us, welcome to today's Meet and Connect session with the Educational Psychology Service. Today we're joined by Dr. Ruth Hewitt and Dr. Naomi Doyle. As always with all of our sessions, they will be recorded, and we will, following the session, the recording will be available on the Walsall Partnership website if you wish to go back and take a look again. You can ask any questions within the session if you just pop them in the chat, and then when the presentation is finished, we will pick them up at the end for you. Yeah, so I will pass over to Ruth. Is it you first?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Ruth. I'm one of the senior educational psychologists in Walsall. I'll just quickly say the way we're going to kind of structure this is I'm going to start off by talking quite broadly about the role of the educational psychologist and kind of qualifications and what we do, and then talk a little bit more specifically about how that translates to our work in Walsall, and talk about the kind of three different areas of work that we have. So Lorna, if you could do the first slide for me. So yeah, so like I said, this is not something I would necessarily expect people to know, so I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about what an educational psychologist is. So the first point to make is that it's a protected title, so that means that we can only legally use it if we've done specific training. I mention this because sometimes you might hear people talk about being a child psychologist and various other sort of similar titles. It's only educational and clinical psychologists that are kind of protected titles. We also need to be registered with the Health and Care Professions Council, which I know some of you will be aware of already because of your own roles, in order to practice. So that means at any point they can check that we have the right qualifications and the right skills to do our job. And if you wanted to, you could go onto their website and check that we are registered. So if you meet an educational psychologist, you can look them up and check that they are actually qualified to do the job. And essentially, the vast majority of us now will have completed a 3-year doctoral training at university, which is why we use doctor in front of our name. But there might be some who trained prior to this who will have master's degrees because they've changed the way that we need to, what we need to do to be qualified. And we will all have previous experience of working in education prior to completing our doctorate. So most people will have had quite a lot of work in schools before doing the doctorate, and will have also done a psychology degree as well. So like I said, I just thought that was useful for you to know, because I wouldn't expect people necessarily to know what our background is and how we trained. I think that'll help you to understand a little bit about what we do. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Naomi then to the next slide.
So kind of leading on from that, so I'm just going to summarise a little bit more about the different types of work that we may be requested to do. So a big part of it is that we apply psychology creatively, and we just try to think about problem solving and thinking through how we can work through more difficult situations within education settings. And typically we work between the 0 to 25 age range as well, so that's also quite broad. So examples of the type of work we may be asked to do would be things, for example, consultation work. So we might do direct work with adults and professionals who are supporting the child or the young person to kind of problem solve and think of ways forward. In some instances, we may provide direct training to schools. So this could be something like we could be focusing on mental health or something like that, or it may be specific academic approaches, evidence-based approaches that we could use. And linking to that, sometimes we may do project work in schools. So, for example, I've sometimes done project work focused on school policies as well. So it may be part of a broader organisational level of support. We're involved in the education healthcare assessment process, and that's part of our statutory duty. And we'll come back to that in a later slide. And there may be instances where we'll do therapeutic work. Due to the nature of our role, this tends to be more short term. So, for example, we may do short-term solution-focused approaches, or we may do kind of short-term CBT-informed approaches. And typical areas may be for things like anxiety or low-level mood and those kind of things. Also, we support trainee educational psychologists. So am I right, Ruth, that we've got Birmingham University and is it Manchester as well? We've got training. Yeah, so that's something. And we'll provide support in terms of providing placements and also opportunities for assessments and general development. And also, as educational psychologists, we do act as research practitioners. So there are a lot of us that have specific areas of interest in terms of research, and many of us have also published research. So, for example, topic areas could be as broad as, again, mental health, but also looking at inclusion and those kind of areas. So we're always, as a service, looking to kind of develop our research and get things published as well. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so talking a little bit more specifically about how the service looks in Walsall. So at the moment, this is the structure we have. So we have a lead educational psychologist, who is Emma Thornbury. Any of you've met Emma before. And we have 2 seniors, which is me and Naomi, and we also have another senior who's on maternity leave at the moment. And then we have 6 main grade educational psychologists, 2 trainees. So at the moment, we've got one from Birmingham, one from Manchester. And then we also have a number of locum psychologists who work with us, and they basically complete statutory work, which is kind of beyond our current capacity to sort of help us to meet statutory guidelines. And yeah, we are usually based at the EDC in Walsall. Obviously, we're not at the moment, we're based at home, but that's where you normally find us. Okay, next slide.
So one of the things that we offer as Walsall EPS is traded work with schools. So schools can actually buy in educational psychology time. So typically they may, for example, buy in packages of 6, 9 or 12 3-hour sessions. And typically there would be a termly planning meeting to discuss the type of work we could do. So for example, we may think about what are the organisational needs in the school. So are there certain things that we could support with in terms of training for staff? That could be a particular area. And it may also be that we'll be discussing specific children or young people who need more direct assessment and intervention. And that's something that we would review every term. Even if schools don't buy in traded work, they will still be allocated a linked educational psychologist. So regardless of whether they buy into the service. And this is a very useful point of contact for the school in terms of general education questions or questions about education, healthcare, assessments and those types of things. So we always like to have a good reach out to the schools in Walsall, just to make sure that everyone's supported. And also linking what we were saying previously, we offer central training as well to all schools. And again, it could be areas such as mental health, but it may also be kind of professional development in terms of specific approaches or academic approaches that could be used in schools. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more specifically about how this looks once we're in the schools that we work with, the schools that are kind of trading with us. So we use a consultation model of service delivery, which basically means rather than kind of having a written referral from schools, so schools are sending a referral form is working through as a list, so to speak. We have these kind of termly planning meetings where we agree priorities with schools, and that can obviously change throughout the term, and it just gives that flexibility for us to sort of be more responsive in terms of if a child arrives in school with very complex needs, we can prioritise that child and sort of change who we work with based on what's happening in school. I'm going to talk a little bit more what we mean by consultation, because this is different, I think, to other professions. So it's about being collaborative, solution focused, problem solving, structured, purposeful, focused on outcomes, it's holistic, rather than us necessarily seeing ourselves as the expert, kind of information gathering and then writing reports, focusing on a deficit within a child, rather than looking kind of holistically at the school as an organisation and classroom as an organisation, and all of those kind of things. So yeah, my view is it's about the expertise of the child and the family and the teacher and the expertise of the psychologist all coming together to find a way forward. Okay, next slide, please. So the reason we do it like this, like I said, is because we think it's more collaborative. Like I said, it's about bringing together the expertise of the psychologist. It's not saying that we are the expert and we have all the answers. It's actually a lot more efficient than us coming in and doing lots of assessment and going away and writing a report. And it means we can immediately give the school some next steps rather than having to wait for a report. Actions are always agreed rather than us saying, this is what you need to do. We will agree with the school what they think the best way forward is. And it's very obviously tailored to this focused child and to whatever setting we're in. Review is also kind of embedded because we'll agree when to review and how to review, and we'll use scaling. So we'll say, where are we now? Where would we like to be at Christmas, for example? And that obviously helps with seeing whether things are moving forward. And like I said, it ensures that we're seeing children by priority and not just in terms of how recently they were raised with us, because sometimes things improve and they say, actually, we don't think we need your help for that child anymore. And sometimes things deteriorate and they might say, actually, we need you to see this child sooner than we thought. What we find is that records will clearly show a kind of graduated approach to meeting that child's needs, which in terms of the SEN Code of Practice is what schools should be doing. Okay, the next slide, please. Where this is quite small, so I hope you can see it, but this is just a flowchart of how our work with schools will look. So essentially we start with termly planning meetings to raise some concerns, we agree the priorities, we share information about the role of the EP with the child and with parents so they know what we're going to be doing. We ask schools to complete a consent form, so parents or the young person, depending on their age, can give their informed consent. We then agree what the objectives are going to be for our work. So school will come with some concerns, but then we will sort of help them to say, okay, well, what will things look like when they're better, so that we know what kind of outcomes we're aiming for. And then we will either just work through consultation. There's some cases where we don't actually need to see the child and we just work with the adults around the child using a consultation model, or we might do observations or individual assessments to help find information that we need to decide next steps. And then at this point, we will always make sure that we gather the views of the child in person and of the parent. The next stage is to agree some actions, and we'll give them a record of our work, which we share with schools and parents, and we agree kind of a time frame for review, and then we review the outcomes against the objectives that we've kind of set, whether they've been met or not, and decide whether they need more EP involvement or whether they're okay to sort of carry on with the interventions for that child. So that's kind of what it will look like when we're working with schools. Okay, lovely. Next slide, please.
So I've mentioned previously, so we do have a statutory role to support with education health needs assessments. And essentially you can find information about that within the SEN Code of Practice. And essentially the local authority can seek psychological advice and information from an educational psychologist who should normally be employed or commissioned by the local authority. Just go to the next slide. So essentially what we provide is an up-to-date assessment. And one of the things that we place a real emphasis on is getting the voice of the child and the young person, having a very person-centered approach, and also the family as well. And linking to that, we also think it's very important to have a strengths-based approach. As much as within our assessment, we'll look for areas that need to be supported, we really want to look at the resilience factors as well to kind of guide the intervention plan. We also will work closely with the schools. So we will hold consultations with the school staff, so someone who knows them well, to kind of get up-to-date information about how they function within the classroom and things like baseline data. And typically, obviously, we're within the COVID lockdown at the moment, but typically we would go into a school and we might do a classroom observation and just see how the child is accessing learning within lessons. And we might also do more direct assessment. So, for example, if we had more of a question about the child's learning needs, we might do a cognitive assessment to get more information about what we need. And I think it links to what Ruth was saying as well. It's very much a collaborative process. It's not just about us as a psychologist going in as the expert, but it's actually getting everyone's views as well and pulling them together. As psychologists, we have to work as evidence-based practitioners. So part out of our assessment, we will look at SMART outcomes. So we need to be thinking about specific areas of identified need and how we can actually measure them over time. And also we need to make evidence-based provision recommendations and intervention recommendations. So this may be a specific program of support for a learning need. So for example, something like precision teaching, or it may be more general strategies that will be useful for the child to support them in the classroom. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so that's the sort of, I said there was sort of 3 areas of work. So we've got the statutory role and our kind of traded work that we do with schools. And there's another kind of relatively small area of work, which is our core work. So this is not part of our traded offer. And it's kind of what we offer to schools, all schools, even if they don't buy into our service. So, for example, one of the things we do is we do half-termly Senko support and share sessions which we offer to all schools, which is facilitated by 2 psychologists. And we do use that for kind of information sharing with Senkos, but we also use it for kind of group problem solving. So Senkos might bring a problem that they're having in school, and the psychologist and the other Senkos there will kind of problem solve with them and kind of agree some actions. So this is something we started doing during lockdown, and Senko said they really appreciated it, so we've decided to kind of continue with that model. Another thing that we do is sometimes we are called to send tribunals, and we're asked to be an expert witness. So that's another kind of area of our core work. We also do work with children who already have an education, health and care plan who are in specialist out of borough provision. So we have a role in sort of monitoring the provision they're receiving, but also providing consultation if there's any kind of issues with their learning or with their well-being, where we can provide support. And then sometimes in sort of extreme cases where there might be children with education, health and care plans who are not accessing education or accessing very limited education, for example, if there's emotionally based school avoidance or something similar, or a risk of permanent exclusion, particularly if that's from a special school, we sometimes get involved there, kind of outside our traded work. And then we also kind of work within the local authority to help to kind of develop processes and practice. So, for example, one of our colleagues is working, looking at kind of post-16 policies and provision and things like that. I'm looking at this year at policies for dyslexia in the local authority. So, like I said, this area of work is quite small, but it's potentially very broad in terms of the different things we might be doing. Okay, and I think that's it from what I remember. Yes. So yeah, it's just any questions.
Okay, so we haven't had any questions yet. But we'll just give it a couple of minutes just in case anybody hasn't had a chance to ask them yet. If not, following the session, we will send out the PowerPoint to everybody along with an evaluation. So there will be an email address where people can ask questions to if they need to ask that. Right, so I think we have just received a question on my laptop. Take down the screen. Right, so is it only education that can refer to your service?
Yeah, so I think this is, like I said, where we're different because essentially we're not a referral service, so we don't take referrals kind of traditionally. We're a service for schools. I think what might be helpful is if I explain a little bit of why. It's because essentially, if there's going to be intervention happening, we're not going to be delivering it. It's going to be delivered by schools because we work with educational settings. So it's really important that the school are, I suppose, are on board, and it's them that are asking for help, if that makes sense, because they're going to be working with us and eventually kind of putting in place different actions. So I suppose what we'd say to other professionals who have concerns about a child in an educational setting is your first step would be to talk to them and say, do you think it would be good to get your educational psychologist involved and sort of do it that way, if that makes sense. It doesn't tend to work if we go in based on a request from someone else and the school doesn't agree that there's a problem.
Lovely. I think we've just got one more. One moment. So hi Ruth, could you please mention the closer relationship between schools, DSLs and the Senkos, particularly when looking at SEMH and mental health being a safeguarding concern?
Yes, so one of the things we ran in July was we did joint training for DSLs and Senkos, which is quite often the same person, around social, emotional and mental health needs in schools, because that's been identified as kind of area of concern. We've then set up a group on Teams for DSLs and Senkos where they can kind of share good practice and have discussions with each other. And we've got another joint forum, a joint meeting for DSLs and Senkos coming up, where we're going to follow up on some of the work that we kind of started. in the first one. Essentially, what we're finding is that schools are struggling with identifying social, emotional, and mental health needs early, and then children are being sort of excluded from school, and then their needs are sort of being identified at that point when we really need to be looking at early intervention. So that's why that work's important. That makes sense.
I think that is actually all of our questions. Yeah, so if following the session, if anybody would like to ask any further questions, would they contact you using the email address provided on the presentation?
Yeah, that would be fine, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, as I said earlier, we will obviously post recording on the Walsall Safeguarding Partnership website. For anybody who wants to go back after and rewatch the session. We will also email out to you if you could kindly take a couple of moments just to complete our survey and copy of the presentation, which will include the contact number and email address for anybody else who would like to ask any further questions. Yeah, and other than that, I don't think we've received anything else. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, and that was really helpful.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.